and electrical engineering. So that's a little bit about myself. And in today's presentation, I'm going to go over a little bit about the state of the art of robotics in general, like humanoids and different Boston Dynamics robots, and the problems with them. And then branch out into a completely different side called soft robotics, and then talk a little bit about different types of soft robots, and then hopefully like give an overview of why we think soft robots is kind of useful. So before I begin my presentation, I want to ask y'all what comes to your mind when you all think about a robot? Like any ideas?
Wally.
Okay.
Aquaman.
Okay, anything else?
Dancer Will Robinson.
Okay. Any other ideas of
Robot.
robot? Okay. Okay. So this is all updated with the current state of robotics. But for me, when I think of a robot, one of the first things that I think of is something more like this. So it's a robotic arm working in like a manufacturing line, helping assemble a car. So what's cool about these kinds of robots is you see that they're made out of heavy metals and rigid components, and they're really good at doing precise movement. So let's say I tell the robot to move from this point to this point, it can exactly move it very precisely and always in a very repeatable manner. And it also, the fact that it's made from rigid materials, it can handle a lot of payload, which is very useful in applications like this. But isn't there anything odd in this picture? Like, do you see any humans here?
No.
And why do you think that we can't have any humans in robots like this near them?
Dangerous.
Okay. Well, why do you think so?
Heavy things moving quickly and not necessarily trained to look for you.
Exactly. So what do you think?
Painting or welding? I can't tell.
Oh, it's
Welding.
yeah, it's welding.
Welding.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous.
Yeah. But also, like the problem with these kinds of robots is, so this is a video from like a few years back. So it's, I think my professor, when he presented here, he showed this video too. So it's me. I don't know why. So you can see that when the robot arm comes, and like the fact that it has a lot of rigid components and it cannot really compensate for anything. So like if it comes and knocks on you, it's kind of like, imagine like a very like statue made out of stone and it just falls on you. So it's kind of the problem with these rigid robots because they're fully made of rigid materials. They cannot really like adapt to the environment that we live in with like humans, where like mostly humans are made from like much more softer materials and we can like adapt to the world and compensate for little changes. But when it comes to these robots, they have that problem. So this is kind of a comparison. So when I ask what comes to your mind when you think of a robot, most people said Roomba and Wall-E, but that's kind of what we think nowadays. But a few years back, kind of like 1961, but it was mostly the time that it was most prominent was around 2006 when like all these car manufacturing lines had like the proper robotic arms. So, but nowadays, back in 2026, we kind of want robots not just to be in these factory lines, but to be with humans and interact with us in our daily life. So this is like an example of Spot, like interacting with a human. So that's more of the world we're headed towards. And this picture, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but you can see that there's lots of humanoid robots and they're all standing next to humans. So that's more of the future that I imagine. And I guess the world that, like the future that we're headed towards, where we want to be around robots, get them to help us with our day-to-day lives, help with elderly assistance, and so on. So when we want to build robots for a world like that, we can't really want the robots to act more like this. So you can see here. That these kinds of humanoid robots. So this video is from like 10 years ago. You can see that when these robots walk, if there's even a slight change in the environment, for example, like a slight uneven surface, or like you could also see upcoming like when it's walking on sand, since the texture constantly changes and the world around us is very dynamic. So you cannot really make sure the robot exactly knows how to behave in all these unknown scenarios. And what happens is since the body is rigid and also the robot doesn't know how to react, it could fail like this. So because of this, so that's actually a video from like 10 years ago. And but if you see videos from now, like Boston Dynamics and Figure AI, all these robots, they're much more better than this. But they can most of the time be safely interacting with us, but still the body of the robot is rigid most of the times. So which is good, but at the same time, it would be nice if we can make some parts of the robot softer. So I'm not saying that we should make the full robot soft, but some parts of the robot could be softer, so it's better optimized. So it's not like fully relying on just software itself. So some of the researchers have thought, okay, how can we like make these kinds of robots a lot more compliant and adapt to the environment better? So one of the first methods was something called a series elastic actuator. So here the idea is instead of having the robot, the motor and the gearbox directly in contact with the external force, like whatever the robot's going to come into contact, you have something like a spring so that it mimics the softness in the robot. And the interesting thing here is this is really cool and it works. So if you all have ever seen any videos of Boston Dynamics Spot, have you all seen any? You see that the robot kind of moves like a real dog. And how it does is it mimics this softness in software and in the motor design, not by actually having any soft components. But once again, this is kind of bulky and also not very precise. So instead of that, some nowadays, like around 10 years back, people have looked into the approach of building robots with softer materials. Are you familiar with Baymax from Big Hero 6?
Yeah.
Yes, so that's more of a robot we want, because I don't want to like handshake with a robot and feel like a metal hand. I want to feel exactly how I feel around humans. So this is actually one of the first soft robots that people have developed a few years back. And here the idea is you use a soft silicone material and you have, so this is pneumatically or hydraulically actuated. So what the idea is that I can pass around to get a sense of what this material is like. So it's like you have a narrow channel in it that you make in a certain geometry. So when you either actuate it with air or with hydraulics, it gives us this certain bending motion. And this is one of the first ones that people have made and the most simplest, where you could have multiple of these and use it to like grasp an object. So what's cool with these kinds of grippers is you don't have to have any sensors. And you can just, as long as you actuate it and it's around the object, it will easily be able to grasp the object. And also you don't have to say, okay, that you have to close at this point. You have to apply this much force exactly. So it's much more simpler and easier. But there's a small problem with these kinds of robots, which I will get into. I'll pass this around so y'all can get a feel for what the material is. So, as I said before, the traditional robots are really good at performing repeatable tasks, and they're very precise, and also they can handle a lot of payload. But meanwhile, soft robots, they're inherently compliant, they can safely adapt, and they're also like much more human-led. So the problem is, what if we have a best of both of us? So in the world around us, in nature, we see in all these biological systems, they're not just made from rigid materials. Like, for example, myself, like if I take my hand, I have soft skin around bones, and then I have cartilage that can change stiffness. So it's a much more like the how humans and nature solves problems is not just a software problem, but it's also like a mechanical problem. And together there's some embodied intelligence in these systems. So what if instead of approaching robotics with just a rigid body with a really complex programming, what if you think and optimize the body of the robot? And in my research, I try to take inspiration from nature and biological systems, study the fundamental, how they work, what we can use for robotic applications, and try to implement that. So these are like few of the animals and plants, I guess, I'm interested in studying and mimicking their motion. So that's kind of a big picture idea of what my research is about and what I'll be talking today. And I'll mainly target my research in three main aspects of robotics. So navigation, locomotion, and manipulation tasks, mainly for biomedical applications or like human-robot interaction applications. So this is more like, I want to show you all a video of what I mean by this embodied intelligence. So here you see, this is called a passive walker. So it doesn't have any motors, it doesn't have any sensors, and you don't give it any power. But purely from mechanical design, you can see that this robot is able to walk through this path like by interacting with the surface as well that it's on. So that's kind of what I was talking about in the sense of mechanical intelligence. So those are some of the reasons why we should think about soft robotics, but there are also other aspects why soft robotics is really important. So traditional robots, they are really good at all those applications that I mentioned, but there are also very specific applications that traditional robots cannot do. For example, here you see in this picture, a person is having exoskeleton. And in a scenario like this, where you want to build an exoskeleton that adapts to the person's leg and it's comfortable for the person, you need to use these softer materials and soft robotic systems. And this is kind of the gist of few different types of soft robots. So this is the previous one, and this is a pneumatically actuated glove that you can help with like hand rehabilitation. This is kind of mimicking octopus tentacles for grasping objects. And this one's called a hazel actuator, so it's like like a electrically like electric field to like actuate the fluid inside and actuate the ripple. But yeah, so that's a few types of soft robots. So this is another type which is inspired from a plant vine. So the idea is, have you all seen vines growing on the walls of like on walls? So the idea is that you see that these vines usually like attach onto a surface and they just keep on growing towards the top. So the idea here is that imagine I'm wearing a sweater and I have a long sleeve. It's like a long tube. And all this material from the tube, it's pulled into one end. And when you pressurize it with air, it just gets diverted out. And the cool thing with robots like this is you can see that it gets function. And as long as you supply it with air still, it can still keep on growing. So this is very useful for some kinds of applications. Let's say over here, as long as you make it with like a fire resistant material and you fill the inside with water, you can divert out the body and you can use it to like extinguish fires. And the fact that the body is soft, it can squeeze through tiny spaces and adapt in like very decluttered environments. And also, so a cool application that I saw of this robot was, which made me go up, was like, so when you want to dig underground, like pipes and holes, like as you keep on digging down, it gets harder and harder. But using a robot like this, you could like, as long as it comes into contact with the sand, it just pushes sand away every time. So you don't have to apply a whole lot of force and you can dig deeper and deeper. And this is they used it for like anchors in spaceships. So that was another lab I saw them working on. So this was kind of how it works. So any questions so far, like anything that I want to explain in more detail?
As you know, just the idea between constructive robots and ISR sensory data collection, how the telemetry might be moved and collected and analyzed.
So the thing is, most of the examples I showed now, they don't have any sensors. And the idea was, since the robot's body is soft, it just passively adapts and moves. But then there are some applications where you'd really need it to be like move in a certain specific direction. And I've seen people having like different pneumatic lines or different wires with tendon-driven pulley systems to make sure that the robot goes in a certain direction. Also, I've seen some people at the tip of the robot, they mount a little camera with a device that you can as the material gets inverted, the sensors and the camera gets pushed outside and it always stays at the tip. So then you can use that to make it move.
So it doesn't sound like they're, let's say, autonomous.
They're not
They're
autonomous.
not.
Yes, they're not.
Okay. All right. That's helpful. Thank you.
But that's the current state it is.
Okay.
But people are working on making it autonomous and okay. So here the base of the robot always stays at one corner. But I've seen some people working on a device where you have two the motor and the inverting system is within the capsule. It's like a little capsule, and then it just keeps inverting itself up.
I'm thinking we make an autonomous test control biomimetic design.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So as I said, the cool thing with soft robots is you can use it for very task-specific applications. The previously traditional robots were not able to be used. For example, so some of the applications that I have in mind are in surgical applications where you deal with extremely soft tissue and also extremely complex anatomy, and maybe underwater applications where the pressure is high, and then you also deal with a lot of sea life where you don't want to apply too much forces or damage the fish in the ocean, or a collapsed building, or even underwater pipe systems. So these are all applications where my work could be used in, but mostly we work in the lab and we try to develop the technologies. And sometimes some of the work that I do, we target specific applications, but mostly I'm still in the progress of getting it developed still. So the first project that I'm going to talk about is called tentacle actuators. So this is inspired from an octopus tentacle. So I think octopuses are really cool, and it's one of my favorite species. And the cool thing with octopuses is when it comes to humans, we have one central nervous system, and neurons go throughout our body. But when it comes to octopuses, they have their nervous system is spread out throughout their body. So every time an octopus if you have an octopus in a fish tank or something, it could sense what's going on around its body. And here I'm going to show you all a little clip where there's some food trapped inside a glass jar. And this octopus senses that there's food inside the jar. And it wraps its body around the jar and opens this jar and tries to get this food. And what's cool is about this is, imagine you had just a traditional gripper made from just rigid fingers. It cannot do all this motion in such a simple way. But the fact that the octopus body can tune its stiffness, it has a whole lot of tentacles. It can adapt to the lid of the bottle, and then it can push its tentacles inside and grasp the food. That's what makes octopuses really intelligent, and also a really cool thing for us to study in robotics, because we can use such kind of design instead of traditional grippers for certain types of applications. So So I just wanted to go back to this side and also show what's cool with these kinds of tentacle-like design is to get like one tentacle, it always coils, and you can like design it in a way that it coils in different ways. But imagine a whole bunch of tentacles collected together. You can like grasp like a very irregular, soft object at multiple points. So instead of trying to grasp something like just like by the hand, like this water bottle, instead of doing like this, I can grasp it at multiple points so the force gets distributed all throughout. And that makes it like able to like grasp really complex objects with no sensors in a very gentle way. So the first tentacle one, how we designed it in our lab, the idea is you have, so the material that I passed around, it's essentially like a party balloon. So it's like a long party balloon that's elastic. So when you inflate it with air, it expands laterally. But the moment, because the material is really elastic, but the moment you add another layer with a different stiffness or like a strain limiting layer, instead of expanding like this, it gives us this kind of coiling behavior. So what we did in our lab is we tried to, so there's already these tentacle actuators developed from Harvard, the one I showed before, the picture. But what we tried to do was, can we always get this coiling pattern in a predictable way? Because the one they developed, it was kind of unpredictable. It just randomly coils. But we tried to make this structure very even and always coil in a same pattern. Because then when we have a whole profile of bending curvatures, we can figure out what application we want. And we can fine tune the size of this tentacle and also how we want it to bend. And we can program how it bends. So this was kind of the asymmetry that I was talking about, the fact that this point is more stiffer than the other end, it gives that coiling behavior. So this is more of how we made these tentacles. I'll later show a video of how it works. But we literally 3D printed like a mold, and then we used the steel rod to cast it out. But when we obviously cast, since we cannot still 3D print silicons, we cannot print these structures. But if we can 3D print, I mean, there are 3D printers that can 3D print silicons, but we cannot print such big structures and it's not easily accessible. So we did the casting method. And we demonstrated how to grasp different kinds of objects, and I can show video. So this is more of the different bending profiles with different materials. And this is how the tentacle actuator starts actuating. So we kind of did some machine learning based on pressure, the geometry of the tentacle, how the bending profiles change. So anybody who wants to build a tentacle, they can input what size they want, what pressure it needs to be working on, and what kind of payload it needs to handle. And then it will generate what kind of dimensions and material selection that needs to go into design. So, and it's really interesting that, so this was made from a silicone called EcoFlex with a layer of smooth silk, and it was able to carry around 300 grams of weight, one tentacle. But it was some of the testing that we did, it was able to even carry more. So a bunch of them together, they can carry quite a lot.
Rashmi,
Yes.
yes.
Quick question.
Mhm.
I came in late, so I might have
Mhm.
missed this answer, but is it always the case that the tentacles are going to be holding objects that are inherently harder than them?
No.
Or is it going to be the case where the object that they are trying to hold is softer than the actual material of the tentacle? And the reason I'm asking the question is, how do you determine in the latter case how much pressure needs to be applied that is not going to deform or even break or spoil the object being held? What have you done in that regard?
So that's kind of I can show you. So this material, this tentacle that I passed around, it's made from EcoFlex, and this doesn't have the strain limiting layer. But this materials, like these silicones, there's many types of silicones that you can use to build, and they all have different stiffnesses. So depending on the application, and like we also know that at a certain pressure, how much force it applies mathematically right now, but we haven't done any testing to see how it physically applies, like when it actually holds something. But if I were to design something, what I would do is I would try to figure out the stiffness of the object that we're trying to grasp, and then see how much weight it has and the dimensions of it as well. And then based on that, you can choose like even softer materials with a higher pressure. You can handle a bigger object. So you can fine tune those parameters to figure out what would suit best for your application. But for most applications, it's not just one silicone. You can probably get away with using like a few variations at few pressures. And this is kind of like at different pressures and different materials how it bends. But we have like tested like 120 tentacles with different compositions. So, and we trained the model to predict for the rest of the materials that we did train. That did physical testing. So that's more of what we have done. But right now I'm collaborating with two other universities to like make these tentacles much more micro scale, because this we haven't still, we're like, we just started. But I want to let you know the idea of what we're trying to do. So the idea is these tentacles are right now pneumatically actuated, or you can even hydraulically actuate them. But instead of doing that approach, we thought of collaborating with one lab that does something called liquid crystal elastomers. So it's a material that when you apply heat, it changes phase and it changes its stiffness, and like you can get actuation. So what we thought was, instead of making these tentacles from silicone, we make them from liquid crystal elastomers, and we have a tiny channel that's filled with a ferrofluid, and then we apply an external magnetic field to heat it. So you can put it inside a person's body or even outside and wrap around different like blood clots, kidney stones, and then make it move around. So that's one of the projects that we just started working on based on liquid crystal elastomers. And another one is, so like one of the questions that you all asked, the payload is pretty good for just soft with just soft silicones, but we were also interested, can we increase the payload further, like to make it much more, handle a lot more load, and also like maybe be more precise, because when a material is soft, it will still have some oscillations in it. So what we thought of was, are you familiar with Scrub Daddy sponges?
What kind of sponges?
Scrub Daddy.
Yes.
Yes. So yes. So those sponges, they're made from a material called polyelectrocarbonate. So whenever you like put the sponge near like hot water, it becomes softer. But when it's in cold water, it's really rigid. So this material is actually biocompatible too. So the idea was we use this kind of material as like a strain limiting layer, and you have like a heating strip, like a joule heater. So when you heat it, the material becomes softer, and like you actuate it still like by air or like hydraulics, but the tentacle is able to hold its position when it's in its rigid stage, when the PCL layer becomes rigid. So that's another project that we're trying to work on. And what's interesting in this kind of area of robotics is you have to figure out how to bond soft materials with rigid materials, and that's not a very easy task to do, because these soft materials are like, if you put a really rigid, sharp piece of plastic in it, when it bends, it's going to tear. And we need to like look into methods where how can you bond it without affecting the material properties. And we're right now trying to use something called flocking. So it's a pre-existing method, but we're trying to see how flocking and all these materials can get combined together. So that's one of the projects I'm working on. Before I move into the next one, is there any questions about the tentacle? Yeah.
So you showed a video of the tentacle actually coiling itself around. How long can it maintain in that position? Done tests regarding that.
We haven't done tests to see how long it can hold that position, but as long as you keep the pressure supplied, it should be able to hold. Because in that video we gave it pressure and we also let it out so it drops out again.
Does the tentacle ever, or I should say the material, does it ever degrade? Is there anything that degrades it being in a acidic environment? You talked about it being placed possibly in water. Anything degrade it or?
So silicones, it will when you actuate it more than these ones, more than 15 times, it starts showing wear and tear. But you can definitely modify the material and apply more additional coatings to make it last longer. That's some of the actually research that's been ongoing right now, in other labs, how to improve the cycle life. And so we haven't tested this specifically in water, but silicones do work well in water. It will still function well. But yeah, you can obviously add coatings of different materials to make it better.
I stepped out, so maybe I missed it. I'm sorry. You do mathematical modeling to predict it. Do what? How do you folks? You do the modeling first, and then you manufacture it, or what's the process?
No, what we actually did was we know that when there's an asymmetry, it's gonna coil anyways, and we also know the material properties. So we did tensile testing of each silicone sample, and we know what's the stiffness of each material that we're using. So we know that when we combine these two silicones together, it's gonna bend. But in terms of mathematical modeling, what we did was we kind of modeled it as two springs with two different stiffnesses, which I can show. So the idea is one spring has a higher stiffness than the other one. So when you apply a pressure, it bends towards that side. And that's how we did the model. But what we actually did was we made a whole bunch of tentacles with different materials. We collected video data of all these tentacles. Then we made a machine learning model, which I did make, one of the other people who are working with me. And he predicted the curvature. So then we have a whole bunch of curvature data for different materials. And then since these are hyperelastic materials, you can predict for the ones that are missing, the material compositions that we didn't test, what's the curvature going to be like. And then we validated it with the mathematical.
Thank you so much.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm wondering, have you done any work with sensors embedded in these soft robots that will tell you how much pressure to apply based on the object that you're trying to hold, and whether to ease off on the pressure or add more pressure with the same material, so that you're not having to change materials based on the object you're trying to hold? Have you done any work on that kind of sensory feedback, kind of haptic feedback with humans?
That's actually really interesting. And that's kind of the second stage of what we are looking into. And the problem with edit sensors, as I said again, most of the sensors that are existing, they're made from they're not super rigid, but they're flexible plastics. And when you attach them to tentacles, we have tried attaching them, the tentacle rips and tears. So that's where flocking comes, where you have to take the sensor and apply a thin layer of fibers, like rayon or nylon, very thin fibers, and then it increases the surface area. And then we apply it onto the silicone so it sticks better. So that's something we're right now trying to do. But to answer your question, you don't have to use the sensor itself, because what I've seen some people do is they collect video data, let's say it's an apple. We know what's the rough weight size of the apple, and then we can predict how much force the tentacle has to bend to grasp this object, even without sensors. But applying sensors would be very useful for something like this.
One question.
Yeah.
Based on your data that you've seen so far, right, and you're saying that you've not tested with the sensors and everything, I'm sure that the last 4 years, the type of sensors and the different applications that are available have also changed. So if I can ask a different question, how current are you with the sensor data as well, the type of different sensors that are available?
Well, I'm not. So I've seen people working on soft sensors for like these soft robotic applications, but the problem is most of these soft sensors you cannot still buy from the market. Like there are other labs working on these sensors, so I cannot go and ask them to use it. Like that's why some of the projects, the LCE and the ferromagnetic one, we are collaborating with two labs from like SMU and another lab in UNT itself. So we can like use what they do with the ferrofluids and the other lab that does LCE to apply power structure. But our lab mostly focuses on what can the mechanical design be like and how can we model it to apply like kind of like a mix of like how to integrate what different labs are doing into a robotic project. But yeah, there are sensors, and I hope before I finish my PhD, I could try to use some of those.
No, this is a very honest response. Thank you. Because one of the things that we see is there's a gap, and the gap is increasing, wherein we are seeing things to be released in like in a very short form and time frame. But the time required to actually make it viable for humans takes a lot of red tape to get. So I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and also like most of these things that I'm talking about, to like since it's a hyperelastic material, even if when you manufacture it, even if there's a slight like excess material in one end, when you actuate it, the way it actuates changes. So to collect our data, we had to make like lots of samples, like 500 samples, and get rid of some of the wrong data. So like that, to actually build it and make it like work in real life, it takes a lot of effort. So that's my first project about manipulation, and the second one is called a fin ray gripper. So this is mostly like inspired from a fish fin, and the idea is, so I have a few that I'll pass along. So usually what happens is when I apply force to this end, it bends, and how it does that is fully like compliant. So the idea is you have two of these jaws together, and I want to lift the object. The moment these like come close together, it just adapts to the shape of the object and it bends. And also you can build this geometry from different materials. So this one's TPU, like different types of TPU, like with different hardnesses. And you can also make them from silicones or like PLA, and that will change how it grasps the object. And also like these fins that you see here, like you can change the number of them to change how it bends. So for our application that we are targeting, so you can see a small clip of us doing like load testing on it. What we again tried to do was, if you just make it from a soft material like this silicone, it's pretty flimsy, and I'll pass it around. But the moment I use another material like TPU, it becomes a lot more like you can control how it moves much better. So we were trying to add again the scrub daddy material into it and see if we can increase the load on the fin ray. So this is a clip of our design. So it has like the PCL strip inserted into one side of it, and there's a joule heater as well. So when you heat it, it stiffens and softens, and then changes the payload while still the fin ray giving its compliance. And the application that we wanted to target was there's something called alligator forceps that they use in surgical applications, and the tip of this whole forceps is made from a rigid metal, like stainless steel. But if you accidentally apply too much force when you try to manipulate with this, they can like damage the blood vessels and so on. So what we thought was, can we use this design, scale it down into this scale, and see if we can replace the tips of this alligator forceps. So that's what we've been working on. But the problem is, when we try to scale it down that small, it becomes really hard to manufacture, because this structure has a whole lot of, like, this tiny feature is a lot more smaller, but these walls are so thin. So, and especially with a material like silicone, it's really viscous. So it's kind of like ketchup, like the texture of silicone, it's that thick. So you cannot really push it into a mold that's that small. Even 3D printing becomes like a problem, because most 3D printing nozzles, the smallest one would be around 0.02 or 0.2. So when you try to extrude out this fluid, since it's so viscous, it's really challenging. So we actually looked into so many methods, and finally we came up with, so this is the smallest one that we have manufactured so far. And the method that worked the best for us was casting it. So we made this special mold. It's very different from a usual mold. So it has like multiple pieces, and you put so we used a type of silicone called PDMS for this. So that was what gave us the best in terms of structural stability, and also like less air bubbles when you like pour in the material. And then at the same time, you also have to add your PCL there to like give it that rigidity that it needs. And I can also pass around like a small scale version of what I'm talking about. So this is the casted one, and this is the 3D printed one. So we 3D printed it from TPU, but the moment the big scale one that you were saying, it's really flexible, right? But the moment you print it this small from the same material, it becomes a lot more stiffer. So you cannot use that material anymore when you want to use it at small scale. And this is the slightly bigger one's PDMS.
Quick question. Is there any reason you have the edges parallel all the way as opposed to trying to mimic a human arm where they kind of diverge? So when you try to hold it like a human being hold something, you have a lot more surface area contact with the object. Is there any particular reason it's always, it's not flaring and it's kind of, and it's always rectangular?
Well,
Curious.
the fact that this specific geometry, that's what gives us this, like when you apply force on it, you can see that it kind of curves, and this comes closer to this. And so when you have two flows like that, and when they both like close, it kind of becomes like a close area that something can be grasped. But obviously, depending on, this would be more of like a general use case gripper. But if you have a very specific use case where you really need that surface area, you could do that. It should work as long as you have this parallel jaws and this kind of geometry in it.
Rashmi, have you tried different ratios of like your elastomer base and your curing agent for your PDMS at all?
We have. So we actually first casted it with the same Coflex that we tried, but it was really viscous and it didn't flow so well, so we couldn't get the air bubbles out. Then and also even if we somehow got it manufactured, it was really soft because it was the softest type. Then we tried a really stiffer silicone called Smooth Silk. So then it worked a lot better. It was much better, but then the air bubbles were still an issue. So that's why we went ahead for PDMS. And I think we used, I can't remember the exact version, like the chemical name of the version of the PDMS we used. But yeah, the one I'm passing around, that's the PDMS that worked the best. And if you want to know more, I can check and search it. Thank you. But right now, what we're actually trying to do is, instead of using just silicones, we're trying to thin out the silicone without changing the structural properties. So like using like solvents to thin out the silicone so it doesn't react with the silicone, but it gets evaporated out, and you still get the same structure, but with a much more originally stiffer silicone. So that's some of the stuff you're trying to do now. So also like the same idea with the LCE, instead of having it like actuated with heat, because when you try to put something inside the body, sometimes putting a lot of heating elements, that becomes the issue. So we were looking into seeing how can we add magnets, like tiny ferromagnets that you can like place around this tentacle, I mean like the fin ray. So you have like two things, and you have like two magnets around it. And since the material is soft, you can use the magnetic field to like bend the material and control how it goes. So this is also something new that we're trying to work on. And so we're collaborating with SMU on this, and they've been interested in seeing if we can use these kinds of fin ray grippers for like like moving kidney stones, and because it's like really soft, you can like push it in the body and remove these kinds of stones. So that's more of what I do with in terms of manipulation in soft robotics. But another cool application that I've been interested is in height climbing robots. So you see this picture, and there's lots of pipes, and usually in like oil and gas industry, there's lots of these pipes, and you don't want to send a human inside these pipes to inspect, and you can't even send a human. There's such tiny spaces. But maintaining these pipes and like inspecting them is kind of really important. So I've seen people send drones to like inspect these pipes, but sometimes there are some scenarios where sending a drone like maybe for a very tiny area, it's not viable. So we try to do robots inspired from snakes and also like inchworms, how they climb on walls to see how that works. So this is kind of my design of the robot. I'll first show the video of how it works, and then I'll explain a little bit about the robot itself if anyone's interested. So what we did was we combined like a soft material with a rigid material, so it can adapt to pipes of different diameters and also pipes of different angles. So this is just like a third iteration. It doesn't work the best yet, but we are working on like improving the design to make it work best. So it literally has two claws, and the two claws can be moved around the rack. And then the racks are made from TPU, like a really soft material, so it can adapt to pipes. So very less sensors, very less bulky compared to the existing designs. And we did a machine learning model to like kind of track its motion. Right now, this pipe climbing robot doesn't really have a whole lot of sensors or like its ability to like autonomously navigate, but that's some areas that we are looking into.
Where is the actuation for this robot? Is it on the pipe climber or is it
On the robot. So we have like two DC motors and two servo motors. So the servo motors are used for the claws, and the DC motors is to make it move up and down.
so is it operated by a battery or do you have a
We have
power source?
we have a power supply. Right now it's like connected to a power supply, and we have like a joystick controlling it moving up and down. But we were more interested in like, can this kind of design work? Because previous pipeline robots, they were a lot more bulky. And even this one, it had a lot of issues. And the video that you just saw, it was actually like an hour-long video. It was really slow. We speed it up. But yeah, but we're trying to make it work better, like work it smoother and make it better. So that's what we're working on. So the last project that I'm going to talk about, yeah.
Sorry, in that pipeline robot, which ones were the soft part?
So
The claws look fairly rigid.
yeah, so this is the overview of the design, and the claws are made from PLA plastic, but this yellow color thing, that's the rack, and that's made from TPU. And it's not fully soft as silicone, but it's not fully rigid as PLA.
And the idea is it can move around plates and things.
Yes, because if it's fully rigid robot, you have to have motors or some kind of actuators at each point to bend and adapt. But since here the two parts that connect are soft, as long as the robot goes close into the top and the other part of the robot adapts to the bottom, it just bends and adapts. But when we were actually testing this, we just 3D printed the PLA and tried to test, and it kept slipping. And then we thought, oh, what if we had some friction, and we used my tentacles from the previous project around the claws, and that made it like, oh, I have more friction now to hold on to the pipes. So like, yeah, so still a work in progress. Yes.
As ML model requires larger data sets, right?
Can you repeat the question?
As ML model requires larger data sets, right? I see what you want.
Yeah.
So is your ML model depends solely on the data generated by this robot?
No, this one, we just followed the principles of an inchworm. So the inchworm kind of like holds on to one end, crawls in, and moves. but we didn't like use this to derive that or something. It was inspired by that, but it just works like the mechanical is.
Okay, using the ML model predictions, are you like just,
Oh, the machine learning model?
yeah,
No, we wanted to like when the robot works, we wanted to kind of get a sense of where the robot's working, like its trajectory. So that's what we tried to do with the machine learning model for the hyperdomain. So it can map out like where it's going, but we control it with the choice. Any other questions? Yeah.
In both these cases, you're trying to grip stuff, right? I mean, and it seems like you have a planar surface where you're actually trying to grip. No use of suction cups in these. I mean, you use the octopus tentacle, and I'm looking at that and saying the guy uses suction cups to grab it.
Yeah.
That get used.
The thing is, with the tentacles, you have like an air, like a pressure, like air compressor, giving it all the air to like actuate. But with an application like this, you don't want it to be very bulky. You want like the only thing that's external is the power supply, which you can add a few batteries and make it like fully self-contained. But if you use something like suction pumps and you wanna like have a vacuum, then you need to have that pressure, air pressure, right? Then it becomes like a lot more bulky, and it's I feel like adding the friction in with the material, because silicones come in a bunch of stiffnesses with like really gel-like ones that are like, I don't know if you've heard something called gecko tape. So it's like a very sticky tape. So using something like that is a lot more easier and efficient. But you can use suction cups depending on the application once again. So the last one I'm talking about is something called non-Newtonian fluid robots. So are you familiar with like Upright or like any non-Newtonian fluids? Yeah, so yes, so the idea is when you mix cornstarch with water, that's the most basic non-Newtonian fluid. When you apply a force really hard, it acts like a solid, but the moment you apply a very low force, it becomes more liquid then. So this is very useful for applications where you wanna like, so what we are trying to do is, it's like a spring mass damper system. So let's say I want to build a robot that doesn't have any wheels and that wants to move on the floor. So we try to use this properties of non-Newtonian fluids to like damp out and then move across surfaces for locomotion. So this project we just started, and right now we are just trying to understand the rheology, so like how the viscosity of these non-Newtonian fluids changes and what kind of forces and like oscillations best gives the properties that we look for. And we have made the first version, but it's something we're working on.
I'm sorry, I'm a bit lost. So, but is the fluid housed in some kind of a housing? If so, what is the coefficient of friction of that with respect to the floor? How would you move that across the floor?
Oh, so the idea is this has a spring and like there's a linear actuator that's moving the spring, but when it moves the spring, the non-Newtonian fluid, it changes its stiffness when you apply force on it. So depending on the movement of the springs, the stiffness of the non-Newtonian fluid changes. And when that changes, it makes it move forward.
But you're still going to have to be mindful of the friction
Yes.
between the two surfaces, right?
Yes. That's obviously like a parameter that we have to consider. But the cool thing is, once we do the rheology for the non-Newtonian fluid, we can change how fast the oscillations move. So we change how much force it applies, and then as a result, it moves different. So, and this is kind of an overview of the CAD design that we did for the initial prototype. And lastly, the project, this is one of my side projects that I've been doing, and we've been pushing it for some of the medical device competitions. So here the idea was the wine robots that I previously talked about, like those soft tissue, like soft robots that grow. So typically in intubation, they have a very rigid instrument that you put in your mouth, like a, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that's a, yes. that instrument, the one you see in the video. You push it in the throat, and then it's semi-rigid. So depending on the anatomy of the person, like for example, little kids, elderly people, like the anatomy changes, and you have to put it in really fast, within like less than a minute. And if it becomes like longer than that, it could damage the vocal cords, and also the person could die unless you perform intubation in like a very short time. So some of the other researchers from Stanford has worked on using wine robots to build an intubation device, because you can put it in the person's mouth, inflate it, and the soft robot will just adapt to the anatomy and just go in and open up the trachea. So we are actually working on improving that design and making it more like scalable, and trying to like actually like test on real EM heat dynamics of these kinds of robots. So that's one of the applications of wine robots that we are focusing on. But overall, so that's a bit of all the projects that I work on. And the big idea behind my research is how to approach robotics in a much more bio-inspired way. Try to integrate soft materials with rigid materials, because when we think of a robot, you should not just think of it in like a one-dimensional, one material approach, because the moment you introduce different materials, and there's a lot of cool materials out there that get actuated with heat, electricity, magnetic fields, and by integrating all of them in a very interesting way, we can make much more like efficient, simpler, and like better robots that can interact with us better. Because the reason is the world that we live in, it's evolved for like thousands of years, and the world that we live in, it's made for humans and like animals and plants. So if we can borrow principles from those things and try to integrate it with the robots, we can build much more better robots. Because, for example, the cup that is water bottle, it's kind of designed for a human to open the water bottle and drink it up. So if you can design a robot which is similar to a human hand, it's going to be a lot more easier for the robot to like interact with the world that we live in. So that's kind of what I do with my work, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm open to any questions.
Stan, are you going to be able to stick around for a little bit afterwards, just in case we have additional questions?
Really great presentation. Thank you. Quick question. The area of research is quite broad. So what specific hypothesis or hypothesis are you focusing on for your PhD? Well, what is the problem you're trying to prove or disprove?
So actually, what happened with my PhD is quite interesting. I forgot to show the one of the most important slides, which was so there is like most of the people who work with me right now. So there's like 25 people. So since I came up with a lot of ideas and they were all working kind of good, my professor was like, "Yeah, you should do all of it." And then the theme that unites everything is soft, rigid robotics. So how to combine soft materials with rigid components together to achieve locomotion, manipulation, and navigation, because most of the robots, that's where they struggle with. So each of these technologies that are developed, you could scale it down, scale it up, and apply these principles in different parts of robotics. But these are all the people who help me, and there's more. So because of them, I get to do all the parts. It is very broad, but yeah, lots of people help me. So yeah.
Next, before we go about, I'm sorry, Steve, then do you guys collaborate with SMU?
Yeah, we do.
Is that significant or just once in a while?
No, we actually just started it like 2 months ago. So that's for the FinRay. And yeah, so I also like was reaching out to different universities to get different parts manufactured. So some people from MIT are helping me cast the FinRay, because like we don't have the injection molding to like cast such fine parts, but they do. So they're doing that part, and SMU is helping us with the magnetics, and then the material science department at UNT is helping with the liquid crystal.
Awesome. Steve?
Yeah, so in the FinRay, you mentioned that you had a couple of magnets in there to control it. How are you controlling the field to bend the ray?
So that's actually something we just started, and that's the one we're collaborating. So there's a lab called Professor Min Jun. So his lab does fully magnetic micro robots. So they have something called a Hermit's coil, and that's what they're using to control the magnetic field. But we are still in the simulation phase of that. So we use something called Console to do the simulations. The magnets, and then once we figure out what's the best magnet size and best magnet arrangement, then they're going to do the actual testing. But that's a new one, which is that.
I think the biomedical and enterprise use cases are pretty good to understand, but have you thought through any consumer use cases for this?
So the intubation device that we just mentioned, that can be actually used for like intubation. So we are trying to. The problem with that, once again, since the tube diverts and the trachea is really small, when the material gets coiled up, the friction is really high. So you need a lot of pressure to evert it out. But when you wanna make it into a medical device and it needs to be small, compact, and EMT should be able to carry it around, that's where we are struggling right now. So we are trying to improve that so we can make it an actual product. But one thing that I'm really interested in, like making as a consumer use case, is the pipe climbing robot, because this is the design that we just submitted the paper, but we are right now working on approaching it instead of an inchworm like a snake-like movement, because we feel that the snake is much more agile and it can move better. So that's something we're trying to see if we can maybe start a startup based on that kind of design, because most pipe inspection, they use drones, but drones cannot go to all the spaces in a pipe system.
Okay, so the pipe climbing thing was interesting. And you talked about actuators, but you drew pictures of just like a standard servo, which means your pipe crawler trails along wires or it carries its own battery.
It has like a power supply.
I'm sorry, say that again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we have a power supply. Like if you see in my video, there was a little wire-like thing that was hanging out. That was the power connection to the robot. So the version that you see here, it doesn't have any batteries. It has an external power supply, and we have a really long wire that lets it like move, but it has a really long wire to supply for the servos.
Well, so the actuator, I mean, it's easy to go, okay, servos and electromechanical energy. But then you were talking about a lot of your technology was based on air pressure.
Yes.
So the actuators trail along wire to get electricity. Could they also trail along tube of high pressure air
They
to
could.
get motion?
The thing is, in this design, we use DC motors and servos, so they need electricity. But if you use something pneumatic or hydraulic, they could use air pressure. But the problem with this design was what we did for testing, right? So when we tested, we didn't care about having the battery pack attached, but eventually we want it to be fully connected because we don't want it to be connected to anything external. But if your use case needs air pressure and you don't want it to have any kind of electricity, yes, you could design it like that.
See, it seems to me that a servo is a large fixed size device that cannot be flexible.
Mhm.
And so I used to do a lot of work with pipes.
Okay.
All right, and as you know,
Yeah.
like there's trillions and billions a year
Yeah.
spent on
Yes.
pipe racks,
Yes.
you know? Yeah. So, but it seems like an air pressure
Mhm.
actuator, you could really change its size and shape a lot easier than you could change the size and shape of an electromechanical device.
Yes. That's actually,
Because a lot of pipe racks are tight,
yes.
right? Yeah, I just, okay.
But I agree with you because also these pipe systems, they have sometimes like they're very warm and then they're very slippery and they have like a lot of pressure. So sometimes maybe using something like a motor might not be the best, but with air pressure, what we've learned is every time you need to have something with air pressure, it gets really bulky, like more bulky than a servo. And so that's why we were looking into like, instead of this design, we try to use something more like a snake, where like it can like coil up. So the servo would be so tiny that even though it's rigid, it's so tiny that it doesn't really matter if it's rigid or soft.
And so you're talking about, you're using servos this big?
Some in this one we use something like around this much.
Yeah, see, that's big.
Mm-mm.
Right. Okay, well, I got it fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, no, the pipe stuff, there's money to be made if you figure that one out.
Yeah, so that's what I'm most excited because I'm like, maybe I should start a startup based on the snake robot.
Yeah, a lot of money to be made in pipe.
Thank you.
Coming to the question, first thing, really interesting presentation. Thank you for that. I kind of walked in here expecting to hear a lot about AI and how we using data to do stuff. And you were talking about materials, and that was introductory. Very interesting, very unusual. Thank you. The question, I guess, maybe this is I expected to hear about prosthetics, and the problem that was in my mind is, let's say when I do this, the muscles are not here, the muscles are here, which is funny, and there are sinews that are actually making other things work. And you seem to still be putting servos at the end result, and which is what is making it bulky. Any ideas or solutions on that front, or how you can use sinew like wires and draw them and let them go in to working like this?
So actually, like in our lab, we have 2 other PhD students. So I mostly work on device manufacturing and mostly like the surgical devices and also like robotics for like human robot interaction. But the other PhD student, so he does more prosthetics. So he does a glove that when people's hands like get tremors, so he does an exoskeleton glove that goes on, but he still uses servos. Because the thing is, with servos, there are like really tiny servos now, and you could like put them up in the wrist, and you can use tension-driven like cords with tension to like pull out the glove. So mostly people do use servos still, as far as I know. But then I do see some labs where they work on hydraulically actuated like pipes and like in tubes to like actuate the arm. But the problem with most of these systems still is they cannot give out, like, let's say the efficiency of them is not that high. So you have to spend a lot of energy for it to bend a certain amount and cannot still apply enough force. So that's something we're struggling with. But I've seen a lot of people working with a lot of interesting materials. Like, so before the PhD student, before he worked on something called phase change actuators. So the idea was to use a low boiling point fluid. So you have a heater attached, and when you apply heat, the fluid heats up and the pressure changes, and that's what you use to actuate it. But once again, we use something called Peltier. So it's like a little device that one side gets hot, one side gets cold. So you apply it when the actuator, like air pressure increases after evaporation, like we cool it back, so it becomes a fluid, it again becomes a gas, and then you use it to actuate. But the Peltiers were so inefficient that you cannot get a lot of actuation cycles. So there's still lots of other methods.
When you create your startup, I don't play.
There you go.
Yeah, so
All right, well, one more time.